What if the Library of Alexandria never burned down? At dawn, the harbor of Alexandria was already alive. Ships from Rhodes, Tyre, Sicily, and the Red Sea slipped past the Pharaoh's lighthouse, its great fire still glowing faintly against the pale Mediterranean sky. Dockworkers shouted in half a dozen languages. Crates of papyrus, grain, spices, astronomical instruments, and books were hauled onto the quays. Somewhere inland in the royal quarter, scribes were already awake, sharpening reed pens, preparing ink, unfolding scrolls. This was not merely a port city. It was an idea made of stone. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE and shaped by his successors, Alexandria was conceived as more than a capital. Under Ptolemy, Isoter and his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus, it became an experiment without precedent, a city built to gather the sum of human knowledge and preserve it against time. At the heart of this experiment stood the Mauseon, the place of the Muses, and alongside it, the great library. To speak of the Library of Alexandria as a single building is already a simplification. Ancient sources describe a complex of structures integrated into the royal district, including lecture halls, gardens, dining rooms for scholars, storage chambers for scrolls, and housing for resident intellectuals who lived at state expense. Later, a secondary library, the so-called daughter library, would be established at the Serapeum, extending the project into the civic heart of the city. The ambition was staggering. According to ancient accounts, the Ptolemies sought to collect every book ever written. Ships entering the harbor were searched for texts. Originals were copied by professional scribes. The copies were returned, and the originals, labeled "from the ships," were kept. Royal agents were dispatched across the Mediterranean and Near East to acquire works of philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, poetry, law, and ritual. This was not a casual accumulation. It was systematic, bureaucratic, and political. Knowledge, for the Ptolemies, was power. To rule Egypt, a land with an ancient scholarly tradition of its own, they positioned themselves as patrons of universal learning. Greek intellectual culture was not merely preserved, it was expanded, edited, classified, and standardized. The very concept of a canon of texts emerged here. Callimachus of Cyrene, a poet and scholar working at the library in the 3rd century BCE, compiled the Pinakies, a massive bibliographic catalog listing authors, works, genres, and biographical details. Though lost today, it is often considered the ancestor of the modern library catalog. What matters for our question is this: Alexandria did not merely store knowledge, it transformed how knowledge was organized. Within its walls, scholars compared manuscripts to correct errors introduced by generations of copying. Homer's epics were standardized, mathematical proofs were refined, medical treatises were debated against observed anatomy. Astronomers tracked planetary motion with an accuracy that would not be surpassed for centuries. Euclid taught geometry in Alexandria. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth, astonishingly close to the modern value, using shadows, distance, and reason alone. Herophilus dissected human cadavers and described the nervous system, distinguishing nerves from blood vessels, something later medicine would forget and have to rediscover. These were not isolated flashes of genius. They were the product of an environment designed to sustain inquiry. Scholars at the Mauseon received stipends, free meals, tax exemptions, and housing. They debated, lectured, disagreed, and refined one another's ideas. Knowledge advanced not because of lone brilliance, but because institutions allowed continuity. This is the first hinge on which our question turns. When we ask, what if the Library of Alexandria never burned down? We are not really asking about fire. We are asking what would have happened if this institutional continuity, this sustained ecosystem of learning, had not been broken. But before we can explore that alternate path, we must understand something more uncomfortable. The library did not exist in a vacuum. It was embedded in politics, empire, and fragility. Alexandria was a Greek city ruling over an Egyptian population. The Ptolemaic dynasty was foreign, dependent on military force, bureaucracy, and legitimacy borrowed from culture. Patronage of knowledge was not purely altruistic. It was a strategy, and strategies can fail. The library's survival depended on royal funding, urban stability, and the assumption that knowledge itself was worth preserving across generations. None of these conditions were permanent. As Rome rose in the West, the Mediterranean world changed. Power shifted away from Hellenistic kingdoms toward a centralized empire with different priorities. Alexandria remained important, economically and intellectually, but it was no longer the unquestioned center of the world. Scholars continued to work there into the Roman period. Figures like Claudius Ptolemy, 2nd century CE, produced works that would shape astronomy and geography for over a millennium. Yet the institutional energy that had defined the early library gradually eroded, and then came disruption. Ancient sources do not agree on a single moment when the library burned. Julius Caesar's fire during the Alexandrian War in 48 BCE may have destroyed part of the collection near the harbor. Later accounts mention damage during the 3rd century CE conflicts under Emperor Aurelian. Still later, Christian and Muslim conquests have been implicated, often polemically, sometimes without evidence. Modern historians increasingly agree on one thing: the library did not vanish in a single night. It faded, scroll by scroll, scholar by scholar, funding cut by funding cut. This matters profoundly for our thought experiment, because what was lost was not only texts, but momentum. The question, then, is not whether a single fire erased ancient knowledge. The real question is this: what if Alexandria's system, its funding, its scholars, its culture of inquiry, had survived intact long enough to transmit its methods, not just its manuscripts, into the medieval and early modern world? To answer that, we must first examine what was actually lost, or perhaps more precisely, what was never fully inherited. That journey begins with the texts themselves. Mathematics half-preserved, sciences partially remembered, technologies glimpsed and then forgotten. And it is there, in the fragile bridge between ancient method and later civilization, that the true consequences of Alexandria's disappearance come into focus. When people speak of the loss of the Library of Alexandria, they often imagine shelves of books turning to ash, an image dramatic but misleading. What vanished was not merely a collection of texts. It was a chain of transmission, a system that allowed ideas to accumulate, be challenged, corrected, and passed forward without catastrophic interruption. To understand what might have been preserved, had that system endured, we must first confront what was lost, or, more accurately, what survived only in fragments, summaries, or distant echoes. Start with mathematics. Euclid's Elements survived, but largely because it was copied and recopied in later centers of learning, especially in the Islamic world. Yet even within Euclid's work, scholars know that alternative proofs and earlier drafts once existed, discussed, criticized, and refined within Alexandrian circles. Those debates are gone. Other mathematicians fared worse. Apollonius of Perga wrote 8 books on conic sections. Only 4 survive in Greek. Others are known only through later Arabic translations or brief references. His work laid the groundwork for orbital mechanics nearly 2 millennia before Kepler, yet its deeper implications were never fully developed in antiquity. Then there is Archimedes. Some of his works survived almost by accident, preserved in medieval manuscripts reused as prayer books, the famous Archimedes palimpsest. That such foundational insights into calculus-like methods, hydrostatics, and mechanical reasoning nearly vanished entirely reveals how fragile the transmission of knowledge truly was. Now consider astronomy. Alexandrian scholars did not simply observe the heavens, they measured, modeled, and argued. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference using geometry and observation, not myth. Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model, placing the Sun, not the Earth, at the center of the cosmos, nearly 1,800 years before Copernicus. We know this only because later authors mentioned it. Aristarchus's own detailed arguments are lost. Hipparchus compiled star catalogues of astonishing accuracy, discovered the precession of the equinoxes, and refined trigonometric methods. Ptolemy's Almagest, produced centuries later, drew heavily on this earlier work. Yet modern scholars suspect that Ptolemy inherited far more data and theory than his surviving texts reveal. What if those earlier layers had survived intact? Astronomy advances cumulatively. Losing generations of observation resets progress. If Alexandrian star catalogues, models, and debates had been preserved and continuously refined, the scientific understanding of celestial mechanics might have advanced centuries earlier. Medicine tells a similar story. The library's scholars did not treat medicine as mystical speculation. Figures like Herophilus and Erasistratus conducted systematic anatomical studies, including dissections, practices later discouraged or forbidden in much of Europe. Herophilus correctly identified the brain as the center of intelligence and distinguished sensory from motor nerves. These insights were not universally accepted after Alexandria declined. Galen, whose medical authority dominated Europe for over a millennium, relied heavily on animal dissection and speculative reasoning. Where Galen contradicted earlier Alexandrian findings, his authority prevailed. Medicine stagnated, not because ancient scholars lacked insight, but because institutional memory failed. Engineering and applied science suffered quietly but profoundly. Hero of Alexandria described devices powered by steam, air pressure, and water flow, including the Aeolipile, often cited as the first steam engine. While largely treated as curiosities or temple novelties, these inventions demonstrated principles that would not be exploited industrially until the 18th century. The problem was not ignorance of mechanics. It was absence of continuity. Without an institution to preserve, expand, and apply such knowledge, technological progress remained episodic. Inventions appeared, impressed, and vanished. Geography and cartography present another loss. Eratosthenes and later scholars produced world maps based on measurement rather than myth. They understood Earth as a sphere, estimated distances, and plotted latitudes and longitudes. Ptolemy's Geographia survived partially, but many earlier and possibly more accurate maps did not. When medieval Europeans later rediscovered geography through Arabic translations, they inherited a distorted picture, missing entire data sets that once existed. Even philosophy was affected. Alexandria hosted debates between Stoics, Epicureans, Platonists, Aristotelians, and skeptics. Philosophical schools cross-pollinated. Logic, ethics, and natural philosophy were treated as interconnected disciplines. When this environment dissolved, philosophy fragmented. The Middle Ages inherited philosophy filtered through selective transmission, often subordinated to theology. The habit of sustained, institutionalized philosophical disagreement, normal in Alexandria, was weakened. This pattern repeats across disciplines. What was lost was not ancient wisdom in a romantic sense, but methodological density, the habit of checking claims against observation, of comparing manuscripts, of preserving dissenting views, of training generations of scholars within a stable institutional framework. The library's destruction, or more accurately, its gradual dissolution, broke that framework. Later civilizations did remarkable work preserving and expanding ancient knowledge. Islamic scholars translated, commented on, and extended Greek science. Medieval European universities revived learning in new forms. The Renaissance rediscovered antiquity with fresh eyes. Yet each revival began from fragments. Imagine a relay race where runners drop the baton repeatedly. Progress continues, but slowly, unevenly, and at great cost. This brings us closer to the heart of the counterfactual. If the Library of Alexandria had never declined, if its texts, methods, and institutions had survived continuously, human knowledge might not have advanced merely faster. It might have advanced differently. The scientific revolution may not have required a dramatic break from the past. It might have emerged organically from it. Empiricism, experimentation, peer critique, these were not alien to Alexandria. They were present, but unfinished. The loss of the library did not plunge the world into darkness, but it fractured a trajectory. To understand how that fracture shaped later history, we must follow the surviving threads, how Alexandrian knowledge traveled eastward, how it was transformed, and why it failed to fully reroot itself in Europe for centuries. That story leads us away from Alexandria itself into the deserts of Arabia, the cities of Baghdad, and the libraries of the Islamic Golden Age. It is there that we see, most clearly, what survival might have looked like. When the institutional life of Alexandria faded, its ideas did not vanish with it. They traveled. Not as a unified corpus, not as a continuous tradition sustained by a single center, but as fragments carried across languages, cultures, and centuries. To understand what Alexandria might have become had it survived, we must first examine where its surviving knowledge actually went, and how it was transformed along the way. The most important bridge between antiquity and the later world was not Rome nor medieval Europe. It was the Islamic world. Between the 8th and 13th centuries, scholars working under Islamic rule preserved, translated, and expanded a vast body of Greek scientific and philosophical texts. Much of what modern Europe later rediscovered from antiquity arrived through Arabic translations, often accompanied by commentary, correction, and innovation. This was not an accident. The early Islamic caliphates inherited territories steeped in Hellenistic learning: Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia. Greek-speaking scholars, Syriac Christians, Jews, and others already possessed fragments of Alexandrian knowledge. What the caliphates provided was patronage, stability, and a renewed institutional commitment to learning. In Baghdad, the Abbasid caliphs established the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. Like Alexandria's Moussion, it was not merely a library. It was a research center, translation bureau, and scholarly community supported by the state. The parallels are striking. Texts were gathered from across the known world. Teams of translators rendered Greek works into Arabic, often via Syriac intermediaries. Scholars debated astronomy, medicine, mathematics, philosophy, and optics. Knowledge was treated as a cumulative project rather than a set of inherited authorities. Euclid, Archimedes, Apollonius, Hippocrates, Galen, Aristotle, Ptolemy, all entered the Islamic intellectual bloodstream through this process, but crucially, they did not remain unchanged. Islamic scholars did not merely preserve Alexandrian knowledge, they tested it. Al-Khwarizmi formalized algebra, building on Greek mathematics, but extending it decisively. Ibn al-Haytham, al-Hazan, rejected purely theoretical optics and insisted on experimental verification, laying foundations for the modern scientific method. Physicians such as al-Razi and Ibn Sina criticized Galenic medicine, refining clinical observation and pharmacology. In astronomy, Islamic scholars corrected Ptolemy's models, identifying inconsistencies between mathematical predictions and observed planetary motion. While they did not fully abandon geocentrism, they developed increasingly sophisticated alternatives, some of which later influenced Copernicus. This matters deeply for our counterfactual, because what survived from Alexandria was not the full system, but enough of it to ignite another golden age under favorable conditions. And even then, transmission was uneven. Some texts were lost entirely. Others survived only in partial form. Many arrived without the institutional context that had once nurtured them. Imagine, instead, that Alexandria itself had endured. Imagine that its scholars had maintained continuous correspondence with emerging centers of learning in Persia, India, and later the Islamic world. Imagine a Mediterranean-wide network of institutions sharing texts, data, and methods across centuries. What would have changed? First, continuity would have reduced rediscovery. Islamic scholars often had to reconstruct missing arguments, correct corrupted manuscripts, or infer lost data. Brilliant as this work was, it consumed intellectual energy that might otherwise have gone toward new advances. Second, institutional memory would have preserved dissent. Alexandria tolerated disagreement. Aristarchus's heliocentric proposal was debated, not suppressed. Competing medical theories coexisted. Philosophical schools argued vigorously. When later religious and political contexts favored orthodoxy, whether Galenic medicine or Aristotelian cosmology, earlier alternatives were often sidelined. A surviving Alexandrian tradition might have resisted such narrowing. Third, application might have accelerated. The Islamic world achieved remarkable technological advances, yet many theoretical insights remained underutilized industrially. Like Alexandria, it valued scholarship for its own sake and for practical governance, but not necessarily for large-scale mechanization. Had Alexandrian mechanical science, Hero's devices, Archimedean principles, been continuously developed within a state-backed institution, the relationship between theory and technology might have evolved earlier and more systematically. Yet we must also acknowledge limits. The Islamic Golden Age itself eventually declined, not because of a single catastrophe, but due to political fragmentation, changing economic priorities, and shifting attitudes toward rational inquiry. Even a surviving Alexandria would not have been immune to such forces. Institutions survive only if societies continue to value them. Which brings us to a deeper realization. The fate of the Library of Alexandria was not unique. It represents a broader vulnerability, the dependence of knowledge on social structures. When those structures weaken, even the most advanced learning can stagnate or vanish. This reframes our question. What if the Library of Alexandria never burned down? Becomes, what if the ancient world had succeeded in creating a self-sustaining, transcultural system of scientific institutions, capable of surviving political change? The Islamic world came closest to realizing that vision, but even it relied on inherited fragments rather than uninterrupted continuity. As Europe later emerged from the Middle Ages, it would again rediscover Alexandria indirectly, through Arabic translations of Greek texts that had already passed through multiple filters. The Renaissance would celebrate antiquity while unknowingly rebuilding something that had once existed in fuller form, and it would do so centuries later than necessary. This delay matters, because while knowledge eventually returns, time lost is opportunity lost. Entire paths of development, technological, medical, philosophical, remain unexplored not because they were impossible, but because the chain of transmission broke. To imagine Alexandria's survival is not to imagine a utopia, it is to imagine a world where fewer rediscoveries were needed, where fewer false starts occurred, and where the scientific method matured earlier, under ancient conditions that were already moving in that direction. The next step in this thought experiment is to follow that delayed rediscovery into Europe itself, to ask how medieval and early modern Europe struggled to rebuild what Alexandria had once normalized. Only then can we begin to imagine how different the modern world might be if that rebuilding had never been necessary. When Western Europe began, slowly and unevenly, to re-engage with systematic learning after the collapse of Roman authority in the West, it did so without Alexandria. This absence shaped everything that followed. Between the 5th and the 11th centuries, European intellectual life survived largely in monasteries, cathedral schools, and a handful of courtly centers. Learning persisted, but its scope narrowed. Texts were copied selectively. Latin replaced Greek as the primary scholarly language. Practical needs, law, theology, administration, dominated over natural philosophy. This was not a deliberate rejection of science. It was a condition imposed by fragmentation. The Roman Empire had once connected roads, cities, libraries, and scholars. When that network dissolved, so did the infrastructure that sustained complex knowledge systems. Alexandria, even if it had survived physically, was now culturally distant from Latin Europe. The result was a long period in which European scholars worked with partial inheritance. Consider astronomy. Medieval Europe inherited a simplified, often distorted version of Ptolemaic cosmology. The Almagest itself was not widely available in Latin until the 12th century, and even then through Arabic translation. Earlier star catalogues, alternative models, and critical commentaries that once circulated in Alexandria were absent. European astronomers learned to compute calendars and predict eclipses, but they did so within a rigid framework. Questioning the underlying model was rare, not because Europeans lacked curiosity, but because the intellectual ecosystem that encouraged such questioning no longer existed. Medicine tells a similar story. Galen's authority became near absolute in medieval Europe. His works, themselves compilations of earlier traditions, were treated as canonical. Where Galen contradicted observation, observation yielded. This was not how Alexandrian medicine had functioned. In Alexandria, Galen himself had been only one voice among many. Dissection, debate, and revision were normal. In medieval Europe, lacking access to that broader conversation, medicine hardened into doctrine. Progress slowed. Engineering and mechanics fared worse. Roman practical engineering, roads, aqueducts, siege engines, survived in fragments. But the theoretical underpinnings explored by Greek mathematicians and Alexandrian scientists were largely inaccessible. Machines were built by rule of thumb, not by systematic physics. Hero of Alexandria's mechanical treatises, which explored steam, pressure, and automation, were unknown in medieval Europe. When Europeans later encountered similar principles during the Renaissance and early modern period, they treated them as discoveries, not rediscoveries. This gap imposed a cost. Knowledge had to be rebuilt from the ground up, often without awareness that earlier solutions had existed. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries appears sudden only because it followed centuries of slow reconstruction. Copernicus, for example, proposed heliocentrism in the 16th century. His work drew on ancient sources, including references to Aristarchus. But Copernicus did not inherit a continuous heliocentric tradition. He reconstructed an idea from fragments, without access to the full Alexandrian debate that had once surrounded it. Galileo, Kepler, and Newton achieved extraordinary breakthroughs, yet many of the conceptual tools they employed, geometrical modeling, systematic observation, mathematical description of nature, had antecedents in Hellenistic science. The difference lay in continuity. Alexandria had been moving toward a synthesis of mathematics, observation, and theory. Europe, lacking that inheritance, had to rebuild the synthesis under entirely different social conditions, including religious conflict, political fragmentation, and technological transformation. Universities emerged as new institutional centers, but they were not initially research institutions. They were teaching bodies focused on preserving authoritative texts rather than generating new knowledge. Only gradually did experimentation and inquiry regain legitimacy. Contrast this with Alexandria's Mausion. There, scholars were paid to research, not merely to teach. Debate was institutionalized. Error correction was routine. Knowledge advanced incrementally, generation by generation. Europe's universities eventually evolved in that direction, but centuries later. This delay had consequences beyond academia. Technological development remained constrained. Without a strong theoretical foundation in mechanics, optics, and materials, innovation advanced unevenly. Tools improved, but industrialization did not emerge until theoretical physics, chemistry, and mathematics matured sufficiently to support it. When the scientific revolution finally arrived, it did so explosively because Europe had accumulated economic pressure, technological demand, and political competition. But it also did so with unnecessary friction, false starts, dogmatic resistance, and repeated rediscovery of ancient insights. The cost of Alexandria's absence was not ignorance, it was inefficiency. This reframes the counterfactual yet again. If the Library of Alexandria had never declined, if its methods and institutions had remained active, Europe might not have experienced a renaissance at all. There would have been nothing to be reborn. Instead, learning might have flowed continuously, adapting gradually to new political and religious realities without catastrophic interruption. But this raises a deeper question. Was Europe capable of sustaining such continuity? Alexandria itself depended on centralized patronage, imperial stability, and cultural pluralism. Medieval Europe, by contrast, was decentralized, feudal, and ideologically unified under Christianity. Even if Alexandrian texts had survived intact, would European institutions have absorbed them fully? Perhaps not, which suggests that the loss of Alexandria was not merely a tragedy of destruction, but a mismatch between knowledge systems and social structures. To imagine Alexandria's survival is therefore to imagine a different world, not only one with more books, but one with stronger institutions capable of protecting inquiry across political and religious change. That brings us to the most ambitious part of our thought experiment. What if Alexandria had not remained isolated? What if its model of knowledge, state-supported research, cross-cultural scholarship, systematic inquiry, had spread and adapted, becoming the foundation of a global scientific culture long before the modern era? To explore that possibility, we must imagine how science itself might have developed differently under uninterrupted ancient conditions. That story begins not with machines or discoveries, but with method. Modern histories of science often describe progress as a sequence of revolutions. Knowledge, we are told, advances through sudden breaks: the Copernican revolution, the Newtonian revolution, the chemical revolution, the Darwinian revolution. Each appears as a dramatic rupture with the past, but this way of telling the story is shaped by loss. It reflects a world in which continuity was repeatedly broken, forcing later thinkers to rediscover ideas rather than inherit them. If the Library of Alexandria and its institutional culture had endured, scientific development might not have taken the form of abrupt revolutions at all. It might have unfolded as a long, uneven, but continuous evolution. Alexandrian science already possessed many of the ingredients later associated with the scientific method. Observation mattered. Mathematical modeling mattered. Disagreement mattered. Scholars compared competing explanations and revised them in light of evidence. What was missing was not rationality, but time. Take experimentation. Ancient science is often accused of being theoretical rather than experimental. This is partly true, but misleading. Figures like Hero of Alexandria built devices to test principles of air pressure and steam. Physicians conducted dissections. Astronomers used instruments to measure angles and distances with care. What they lacked was a sustained culture of systematic experimentation over generations. In a surviving Alexandria, that culture could have emerged gradually. As instruments improved, measurements would become more precise. Errors would be identified and corrected. Models would be refined rather than replaced wholesale. The result might have been something closer to modern science centuries earlier, but without the trauma of rupture. Consider astronomy again. Aristarchus proposed heliocentrism, but his idea did not triumph. Not because it was obviously false, but because the available observational data and mathematical tools were insufficient to decisively support it. Geocentrism, especially in its refined Ptolemaic form, worked well enough. If Alexandrian astronomy had continued uninterrupted, two things might have changed. First, long-term observation would have accumulated. Star positions, planetary motions, and anomalies recorded over centuries would have provided a richer data set than any individual observer could manage. Second, mathematical tools, especially trigonometry, would have matured further, allowing more precise modeling. Under those conditions, the shortcomings of geocentrism might have become undeniable much earlier. Heliocentrism would not have arrived as a radical shock, but as the gradual outcome of accumulated discrepancies and improved models. The same pattern applies to physics. Archimedes developed principles of statics and hydrostatics with extraordinary rigor. His method of reasoning, balancing forces, quantifying relationships, anticipates later mechanics. Yet these insights were not fully integrated into a broader physical theory of motion. Why? Because the institutional setting to sustain that integration over generations was fragile. In a continuous Alexandrian tradition, Archimedean mechanics could have been extended, formalized, and unified with astronomical modeling. Concepts resembling inertia, momentum, and force might have emerged not in the 17th century, but in late antiquity or the early medieval period. This is not speculative fantasy. It is extrapolation from existing trajectories. Medicine offers perhaps the clearest example. Alexandrian anatomists emphasized observation and dissection. They identified structures and functions accurately. What they lacked was large-scale clinical data and long-term epidemiological study. A surviving Alexandrian medical institution could have become a center for comparative anatomy, public health, and pharmacology. Diseases might have been classified more systematically, surgical techniques refined earlier. The dominance of unchallenged authority, so characteristic of later Galenic medicine, might never have taken hold. Scientific progress depends not only on ideas, but on error correction. Alexandria excelled at correcting texts. It could have excelled at correcting theories as well, given time. This leads to a crucial distinction. The modern scientific revolution appears revolutionary because it followed centuries of stagnation. In a world without that stagnation, the same insights might have emerged incrementally, without the social and intellectual shock that later accompanied them. Religion would still have mattered. Politics would still have intervened. No intellectual system is immune to power. But the relationship between science and authority might have evolved differently. In medieval Europe, natural philosophy often existed under theological oversight. Scientific claims were evaluated not only for accuracy, but for doctrinal compatibility. Conflict was inevitable once empirical findings challenged inherited interpretations. Alexandrian science, by contrast, emerged in a polytheistic, pluralistic environment. While not free of dogma, it lacked a single authoritative scripture governing cosmology or natural law. That flexibility mattered. A continuous Alexandrian tradition, adapting through Roman, Christian, and Islamic periods, might have negotiated these tensions more smoothly, integrating new religious frameworks without surrendering empirical method. This does not mean science would have dominated society. Ancient and medieval cultures valued wisdom, tradition, and moral order alongside knowledge. What might have changed is the legitimacy of inquiry itself. Questioning nature would have remained normal rather than transgressive. Technological consequences would follow slowly but profoundly. Industrialization did not occur simply because steam engines existed. It required metallurgy, energy demand, capital, labor organization, and political incentives. Alexandria alone could not have produced factories, but it could have accelerated the intellectual foundations upon which industrialization later depended. Thermodynamics, material science, optics, these fields matured late because their underlying principles were scattered across disciplines and centuries. A continuous research culture might have unified them earlier. The world might not have industrialized in antiquity, but it might have entered an early modern phase centuries sooner. This raises uncomfortable questions. Earlier scientific and technological development could have intensified inequality, exploitation, and environmental strain earlier as well. Progress is not neutral. It amplifies human capacity for good and ill, which means that a world shaped by uninterrupted Alexandrian science would not necessarily be more humane. It would be more different, and that difference would extend beyond laboratories and libraries into economics, warfare, navigation, and governance. To explore that, we must ask how knowledge translates into power. Alexandria was not merely an academic project. It existed within an imperial system. If its scientific capacity had grown continuously, how would states have used it? That question leads us to the next stage of our thought experiment: the relationship between sustained ancient science and empire, exploration, and global dominance. Knowledge does not remain abstract for long. When preserved, refined, and transmitted across generations, it reshapes how societies organize power, project influence, and imagine their place in the world. If the Library of Alexandria had survived as a living institution, sustaining scientific inquiry across centuries, its effects would not have been confined to scholars and texts. They would have altered the very mechanics of empire. To understand how, we must remember that ancient empires already valued knowledge deeply. The Ptolemaic state funded astronomy to improve navigation and calendar systems. Roman administrators relied on surveying, engineering, and law to govern vast territories. Islamic caliphates invested in geography, mathematics, and medicine to manage trade routes and cities. What limited these empires was not ambition, but integration, scientific insight, administrative practice, and technological application rarely developed in concert over long periods. Breaks in institutional continuity meant that knowledge often advanced in isolated bursts, then stagnated. A surviving Alexandria could have changed this dynamic. Consider navigation and exploration. Ancient mariners already understood the Earth to be spherical. Eratosthenes' calculation of Earth's circumference was known in antiquity. Greek and Roman geographers estimated distances and mapped coastlines with growing precision. What they lacked were reliable instruments, standardized maps, and institutional memory capable of sustaining long-distance exploratory projects. If Alexandrian astronomy and geography had continued uninterrupted, navigation might have advanced centuries earlier. Improvements in celestial navigation, latitude measurement, and cartographic projection could have transformed Mediterranean seafaring into true oceanic exploration long before the 15th century. This does not mean ancient Greeks would have sailed to the Americas, but it does suggest that the conceptual and technical barriers to such voyages might have eroded earlier. Knowledge accumulates. Once navigational uncertainty decreases, political and economic incentives follow. Empires expand not only because they desire conquest, but because they can manage distance. A world with better maps, more accurate calendars, and improved ship design, developed through sustained scientific inquiry, would have seen different patterns of expansion. Trade networks might have grown broader earlier. Contact between distant cultures could have intensified gradually rather than explosively. This gradualism matters. The early modern age of discovery was disruptive precisely because it compressed centuries of potential interaction into a few decades. Sudden encounters produced conquest, disease, and collapse. Earlier, slower integration might not have prevented violence, but it could have altered its scale and tempo. Now consider warfare. Alexandrian science included mechanics, ballistics, optics, and materials. Archimedes designed war machines to defend Syracuse. Engineers built siege engines, fortifications, and artillery long before gunpowder. What limited ancient warfare was not creativity, but precision and reproducibility. A continuous research institution could have refined ballistic modeling, materials testing, and mechanical reliability over generations. Siegecraft and defense would have become more scientific, less improvised. States with access to such knowledge would gain decisive advantages. This raises an uncomfortable truth. Earlier scientific continuity would likely have intensified imperial competition. Empires are not passive recipients of knowledge. They weaponize it. If Alexandrian science had matured within imperial systems, Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, it might have accelerated arms races earlier. Military engineering, logistics, and strategy would have become more analytical sooner. War would not disappear. It would become more efficient. Yet efficiency cuts both ways. States that rely on scientific administration also tend to bureaucratize. Taxation, census-taking, infrastructure planning, all benefit from mathematical and geographical knowledge. Empires grounded in such systems often prefer stability over constant conquest, because stability maximizes return on investment. Rome already exhibited this tendency. A scientifically enriched imperial administration might have governed more predictably, if not more justly. Infrastructure could have been planned with greater foresight. Urban sanitation, water management, and public health might have improved earlier. This points to a paradox. Sustained knowledge can both empower domination and mitigate its worst excesses. It sharpens tools of control while revealing the costs of chaos. Alexandria sat at the crossroads of these possibilities. Its scholars advised rulers but also critiqued them. They served the state, yet preserved a degree of intellectual autonomy. This balance was fragile, but instructive. If Alexandrian-style institutions had spread, replicated in Rome, Constantinople, Baghdad, perhaps even in South Asia or China, the global balance of power might have evolved differently. Instead of a single dramatic rise of European dominance after 1500, we might see multiple regional powers advancing in parallel, constrained by shared scientific norms and competitive parity. Global history would still be unequal, but it might be less abrupt. Technology would diffuse through scholarly networks rather than being hoarded as state secrets. Knowledge would travel faster than conquest. This is not a claim of inevitable peace. It is a claim of altered structure. Power depends on predictability. Science increases predictability. Empires that understand their environment tend to govern differently from those that rule through myth and improvisation. Yet this imagined world also carries risk. Earlier scientific integration could have intensified environmental exploitation sooner. Mining, deforestation, and agriculture might have expanded more aggressively under scientific management. Without modern ecological awareness, damage could accumulate silently. Progress accelerates consequences, which brings us to an essential caution in this counterfactual. The survival of the Library of Alexandria would not have produced a linear march toward enlightenment. It would have produced a more continuous interaction between knowledge and power, one in which benefits and harms emerged together, earlier and more entangled. The real tragedy of Alexandria's loss is not that humanity remained ignorant. It is that humanity lost the chance to learn gradually. Instead, knowledge surged in waves, followed by collapse, followed by rediscovery, each time carrying heavier consequences. To imagine Alexandria's survival is therefore to imagine a world where the relationship between science and power matured slowly, with fewer shocks and more feedback. But power is never the only force shaping history. Religion, culture, and moral frameworks determine how knowledge is interpreted and used. Alexandria's pluralistic intellectual environment did not survive intact into later eras. So the next question must be this: if Alexandrian knowledge had endured, how would it have interacted with emerging religious worldviews, Christianity, Islam, and beyond? Would faith and reason have clashed more violently, or found earlier accommodation? The answer to that question takes us into the realm of belief, authority, and meaning, where the survival of knowledge poses its most profound challenges. The survival of the Library of Alexandria would not only have shaped science and empire, it would have confronted one of the most powerful forces in human history: faith. From late antiquity onward, the Mediterranean world was transformed by religious movements that claimed universal truth. Christianity, emerging from a persecuted sect into an imperial religion, reshaped institutions, moral authority, and intellectual life. Islam, centuries later, would do the same across a vast territory stretching from Spain to Central Asia. Each tradition developed its own relationship to reason, revelation, and learning. Alexandria stood at the intersection of these forces. Long before Christianity became dominant, Alexandria was already a city of religious diversity. Egyptian priesthoods, Greek polytheists, Jews, and later Christians lived in close proximity. The city produced some of the earliest Christian theologians, Clement of Alexandria and Origen, who attempted to reconcile Greek philosophy with Christian doctrine. This is crucial. Alexandria was not inherently hostile to faith. It was a place where belief and reason met early, sometimes uneasily, sometimes creatively. Had the library survived as a living institution, it would have become a testing ground for how revealed religion and empirical inquiry could coexist, not in theory, but in practice. Consider early Christianity. As Christianity spread, it inherited a complex relationship with classical learning. Some church fathers viewed Greek philosophy as a valuable preparatory discipline. Others regarded it as dangerous pagan influence. Over time, especially after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, institutional priorities shifted. Theological orthodoxy increasingly defined intellectual legitimacy. In our actual history, this shift coincided with the weakening of secular scholarly institutions. Alexandria's decline removed a counterweight, an institution whose authority rested not on revelation, but on inquiry. Had the library remained strong, the balance might have been different. Christian scholars working in or alongside Alexandrian institutions would have been exposed continuously to methods of textual criticism, mathematical reasoning, and empirical observation. Scripture itself might have been subjected more openly to philological analysis, as Homer had been centuries earlier. This would not have dissolved faith, but it might have normalized interpretive flexibility. The idea that sacred texts could be studied historically and linguistically, so controversial in later centuries, was already present in Alexandria. Origen, for example, emphasized allegorical interpretation and acknowledged textual variance in Scripture. With institutional backing, such approaches might have become mainstream rather than marginal. The result could have been a Christian intellectual culture less threatened by scientific inquiry because it would have grown alongside it from the beginning. Islam offers an even more striking comparison. When Islamic civilization rose in the 7th and 8th centuries, it encountered Greek knowledge largely through the remnants of the Alexandrian tradition. Early Islamic scholars famously declared that seeking knowledge was a religious duty. The Quran itself encouraged reflection on nature as a sign of divine order. This created a fertile environment for science. But tensions emerged. As theological schools debated the limits of reason, rationalist traditions, such as the Mu'tazila, eventually lost influence to more conservative currents. Philosophy and natural science continued, but often under suspicion. Here again, institutional continuity mattered. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad flourished, while Caliphal patronage protected it. When political priorities shifted, that protection weakened. Without deep-rooted, independent scholarly institutions, rational inquiry became vulnerable. A surviving Alexandria, older, more established, and culturally plural, might have offered a different model. Rather than knowledge being legitimated by theology, theology might have been one discourse among many within a broader intellectual ecosystem. Religious scholars would engage with science not as an external challenge, but as an inherited tradition. Conflict would still occur, but it might be less existential. The most explosive conflicts between faith and science in later European history, the condemnation of heliocentrism, the suspicion of anatomy, the resistance to geological time, arose in contexts where scientific inquiry appeared as a disruptive newcomer. In an Alexandrian continuous world, science would not be new, it would be ancestral. This distinction matters. Authority is threatened not by disagreement alone, but by unfamiliarity. When methods of inquiry are long established, they are harder to dismiss as subversive. This does not mean religion would surrender power. Religious institutions adapt, they reinterpret, they incorporate, they resist selectively. A continuous Alexandrian tradition would have been shaped by religious pressures just as much as it shaped them. Yet the dialogue itself would be older, deeper, and less polarized. The boundary between sacred and secular knowledge might never have hardened as sharply as it did in early modern Europe. Universities might have emerged earlier as hybrid institutions, places where theology, natural philosophy, and mathematics coexisted without rigid hierarchy. Such a world would still face censorship, dogma, and conflict, but the fault lines would be different. Rather than science versus religion, debates might center on competing interpretations of order, purpose, and causality, arguments conducted within a shared intellectual language. This could have altered the pace of intellectual emancipation. The Enlightenment, as we know it, emerged in part as a rebellion against religious authority perceived as hostile to reason. In a world where reason had never been fully expelled, such rebellion might not be necessary. Change would occur through negotiation rather than rupture. Yet here, too, caution is necessary. Alexandria itself was not immune to violence rooted in religious conflict. The city witnessed riots, persecutions, and the brutal murder of the philosopher Hypatia in the early 5th century. CE, a symbol, often exaggerated but still instructive, of the fragility of intellectual tolerance. The library's survival would have required more than walls and scrolls. It would have required a social consensus that inquiry deserved protection even amid deep belief. Whether such a consensus could endure across centuries of doctrinal conflict remains uncertain. But uncertainty cuts both ways. History shows that when institutions disappear, extremism flourishes more easily. Where pluralistic spaces endure, absolutism struggles. The Library of Alexandria represented such a space, not perfect, but rare. Its survival could have offered a model for how civilizations integrate knowledge and belief without demanding total victory from either. And that model might have influenced not only science and theology, but the very structure of education itself. Because knowledge, once protected from destruction, still requires something else to survive: transmission. To imagine Alexandria's endurance is to imagine a world with a very different educational map, one where universities, curricula, and literacy developed earlier and more broadly. That transformation, in turn, would reshape who had access to knowledge and therefore who held power. The survival of the Library of Alexandria would not only have reshaped elite scholarship. Over time, it would have altered who learned, how learning was structured, and how widely knowledge circulated. Education is never neutral. It reflects power, social hierarchy, and assumptions about who is worthy of instruction. In the ancient world, literacy was limited, formal education was elite, and advanced knowledge was often guarded. Yet Alexandria contained the seeds of a different model, one that, given time, might have expanded access to learning far earlier than in our own history. The Mouseion was not a school in the modern sense, but it functioned as something more advanced than most ancient institutions. Scholars were salaried, research was collective, knowledge was catalogued, preserved, and debated openly within the institution. Crucially, learning was not tied to priesthood or family lineage. It was tied to participation. This distinction matters. In most ancient societies, education was either vocational, training scribes, administrators, or artisans, or philosophical, reserved for small circles. Alexandria blurred these boundaries. Mathematics served astronomy. Medicine served public health. Grammar served textual criticism. Knowledge was integrated. If this institutional model had survived and expanded, education itself might have evolved differently. First, consider standardization. Alexandrian scholars already worked to standardize texts, terminology, and methods. Over centuries, this could have produced shared curricula across regions, common foundations in mathematics, logic, and natural philosophy taught consistently from one generation to the next. Such standardization accelerates learning. It reduces redundancy. It allows students to build on established foundations rather than relearning basics unevenly. In medieval Europe, the absence of standardized curricula meant that education varied wildly by region and institution. Students often encountered contradictory authorities without tools to reconcile them. Progress was slow and fragile. A continuous Alexandrian tradition could have avoided much of this fragmentation. Second, consider teacher training. Alexandria did not merely produce texts, it produced scholars trained to teach, critique, and refine ideas. If that tradition had spread, the profession of teaching might have developed earlier as a recognized, supported role, rather than as an adjunct to religious office. This matters for literacy. Literacy expands when teaching becomes systematic and socially valued. In our history, widespread literacy did not emerge until printing, urbanization, and state education systems converged in the early modern period. But literacy is not technologically determined alone. It requires institutions that see reading and writing as essential skills rather than elite privileges. Alexandria's commitment to collecting texts implied a belief in preservation and access. Over time, that belief could have translated into broader educational outreach. Apprenticeships, preparatory schools, and regional centers linked to the central library. Knowledge would still flow unevenly, but the baseline would rise. Third, consider translation. Alexandria was multilingual. Greek scholars engaged with Egyptian, Persian, Babylonian, and later Jewish knowledge traditions. Translation was not peripheral, it was central. This practice, sustained over centuries, could have normalized cross-cultural learning far earlier. Rather than knowledge being confined within linguistic or religious boundaries, translation would remain an expected scholarly duty. This has profound implications. Many historical dark ages were not periods of ignorance, but periods of disconnection, where knowledge existed somewhere, but not where it was needed. A continuous Alexandrian network of translation and education could have reduced these gaps. Fourth, consider social mobility. Education creates pathways. In societies where learning is institutionalized, individuals outside traditional elites can sometimes rise through intellectual achievement. This was true, in limited form, even in ancient Alexandria, where scholars from diverse backgrounds contributed to the library's work. If that model had expanded, education might have become a recognized route to administrative, medical, or advisory roles earlier in history. Bureaucracies would value trained minds, not just noble birth. This does not eliminate inequality, but it reshapes it. States governed by educated administrators tend to rely more on law and record-keeping than on arbitrary rule. Predictability increases. Violence decreases not because rulers become benevolent, but because stable systems serve their interests. Education, in this sense, is a technology of governance. Yet here lies a critical tension. Wider access to knowledge also produces dissent. Educated populations ask questions. They challenge authority. They demand accountability. This is why many regimes throughout history restricted education deliberately. A surviving Alexandria, if it succeeded too well in spreading learning, might provoke resistance from political and religious authorities who perceived education as destabilizing. This tension is not hypothetical. We see it repeatedly in history, in the suppression of heretical texts, in censorship, in the control of universities, in the persecution of intellectuals. Alexandria's endurance would therefore require not just institutional survival, but political negotiation. Its scholars would have to justify their value continually, not only as preservers of wisdom, but as servants of social order. This balancing act would shape education's trajectory. It might slow democratization, it might limit access strategically, but it would not erase the underlying trend. Once knowledge institutions exist, pressure builds to expand them. Over centuries, literacy would spread not because rulers desired it, but because complex societies require it. Trade requires accounting. Law requires documentation. Medicine requires training. Engineering requires mathematics. Education follows necessity. A world with continuous Alexandrian learning would reach those necessities earlier. Yet we must resist idealization. Education does not automatically produce enlightenment. An educated society can be more efficient at exploitation as well as innovation. Bureaucracies can oppress as effectively as armies. Literacy can spread propaganda as easily as truth. The survival of Alexandria would amplify human capacity, not moral clarity. Which leads us to the most sobering part of this thought experiment. If knowledge advanced earlier, if institutions matured sooner, if education spread more widely, then the scale of human impact on the world would also increase earlier. Technological power without ethical restraint can be catastrophic. So, the final question is not simply whether the world would be more advanced. It is whether humanity would be better prepared to wield that advancement. To answer that, we must look beyond science and education to something more elusive: ethics, philosophy, and long-term thinking. Alexandria housed philosophers as well as scientists. Ethics, politics, and natural philosophy were intertwined. If that tradition had endured, moral reasoning might have evolved alongside technical power rather than lagging behind it. But this is the hardest counterfactual of all. Would wisdom have kept pace with knowledge? Or would humanity merely have made its mistakes sooner? The answer is not obvious, and that uncertainty is where our final stretch begins. Because to imagine Alexandria's survival fully, we must confront its ultimate legacy, not as a building or a library, but as a warning about how fragile progress truly is. It is tempting, when imagining a world in which the Library of Alexandria never declined, to picture an earlier age of reason, an ancient enlightenment where science flourished, superstition faded, and humanity advanced smoothly toward modernity. History warns us against this temptation. Knowledge does not abolish consequences, it accelerates them. If Alexandrian science had survived and matured without interruption, feeding into governance, education, and technology centuries earlier, humanity's capacity to reshape the world would have grown sooner. And with that capacity would come costs, often invisible at first. Consider technology. Alexandrian engineers already understood leverage, hydraulics, pneumatics, and automation. Heroes' devices demonstrated that natural forces could be harnessed predictably. Archimedes showed how mathematics could govern machines. Given institutional continuity, these principles could have been refined, scaled, and systematized. Earlier advances in mechanics would likely lead to earlier mechanization, not industrialization as we know it, but localized increases in productivity. Water-powered mills, mining technology, construction techniques, and agricultural tools might have improved steadily. This would transform economies. Increased productivity frees labor, but it also concentrates wealth. Elites who control knowledge and capital benefit disproportionately. Without modern political concepts of representation or labor rights, technological advantage could harden social hierarchies rather than dissolve them. Alexandria's survival might produce earlier efficiency, but not necessarily earlier equality. Now, consider the environment. Ancient societies already altered landscapes dramatically. Deforestation around the Mediterranean began long before the Roman Empire peaked. Mining scarred hillsides. Agriculture reshaped river systems. These changes occurred slowly enough that consequences accumulated over centuries rather than decades. A world with earlier scientific understanding of mechanics, materials, and resource extraction could accelerate these processes. Forests might disappear sooner. Soil depletion could intensify. Urbanization could expand beyond sustainable limits earlier in history. Without ecological science, without a concept of environmental feedback, technological success becomes self-destructive. Alexandria possessed no modern environmental ethic. Its scholars studied nature, but largely as an object of understanding or exploitation. The idea that human activity could destabilize planetary systems would not emerge until much later, even in our timeline. So, an earlier scientific tradition might push humanity toward environmental crisis sooner, not later. This does not mean collapse was inevitable, but it means progress would demand ethical frameworks capable of restraining it. Which brings us to philosophy. Alexandrian philosophy was rich, diverse, and deeply concerned with ethics. Stoics emphasized moderation and natural order. Epicureans stressed limits and balance. Platonists explored the relationship between reason and the good. Aristotelians focused on purpose and virtue. These traditions could have evolved alongside science. In fact, Alexandria's great strength was precisely this integration. Ethics was not separate from natural philosophy. Questions about how the world works were inseparable from questions about how one should live. If that integration had endured, ethical reasoning might have matured earlier in response to technological power. But ethical reasoning alone does not constrain states. Power listens to ethics when ethics align with interest. Here lies the danger. States armed with scientific knowledge gain advantage over rivals. That advantage incentivizes expansion, extraction, and control. Ethical restraint becomes costly unless shared widely. In our history, industrialization raced ahead of global ethical consensus. The result was imperialism, environmental degradation, and mass warfare on an unprecedented scale. In an Alexandrian continuous world, these dynamics might unfold earlier, but also differently. Earlier scientific parity across regions could reduce extreme imbalances. If multiple centers of learning developed in parallel, no single civilization would dominate overwhelmingly. Competition might remain contained, bounded by mutual capability, or it might escalate faster. We cannot know. What we can say is this: the loss of Alexandria delayed humanity's confrontation with the consequences of knowledge. When those consequences finally arrived, industrial pollution, mechanized war, climate impact, they arrived suddenly, overwhelming moral and political institutions that had not evolved to manage them. An earlier confrontation might have been less catastrophic, or it might have been equally destructive, merely shifted in time. This ambiguity is central to the thought experiment. It reminds us that Alexandria's destruction, or decline, was not simply a tragedy of lost wisdom. It was a delay in humanity's reckoning with its own power. Yet even here, Alexandria offers a lesson. Its scholars emphasized debate. They preserved dissenting views. They compared traditions rather than enforcing uniformity. These habits matter deeply when confronting complex, long-term consequences. Modern environmental science emerged slowly because it required interdisciplinary thinking: physics, chemistry, biology, economics, ethics. Alexandria already practiced interdisciplinarity in embryonic form. If that tradition had matured, responses to environmental strain might have emerged earlier, not to prevent damage entirely, but to recognize it sooner. Still, recognition does not guarantee action. Human societies struggle to act against slow-moving threats, even when evidence is clear. Knowledge illuminates danger, but does not compel sacrifice, which leads us to a sobering conclusion. The survival of the Library of Alexandria would not have saved humanity from itself. It would have forced humanity to face itself earlier. Earlier science means earlier responsibility. Earlier responsibility means earlier failure or earlier wisdom. Which one dominates depends not on libraries alone, but on the values societies choose to uphold. At this point in our exploration, we must confront the central irony of the Alexandria question. We imagine its survival as a guarantee of progress, but progress is not linear. Institutions can preserve knowledge, but they cannot ensure its use aligns with human flourishing. Alexandria's greatest contribution, had it survived, might not be any single discovery. It might be the normalization of thinking long-term, of treating knowledge as cumulative, fragile, and worthy of protection beyond immediate utility. That brings us to the final phase of our inquiry. Not what would the world look like technologically or politically, but what would humanity understand about itself? What does the story of Alexandria ultimately tell us about civilization, memory, and the cost of forgetting? The answer lies not in counterfactual history alone, but in reflection. By this point in our thought experiment, the Library of Alexandria has become more than a building, more than even an institution. It has become a symbol, one that reveals something unsettling about how civilizations remember, forget, and imagine progress. Because the deepest lesson of Alexandria is not about what humanity might have achieved earlier. It is about how easily achievement can be undone. Civilizations often assume that knowledge, once discovered, is permanent. That writing fixes ideas, that institutions preserve memory, that progress accumulates naturally over time. Alexandria disproves all of this. The library was not destroyed because knowledge failed. It was lost because the social conditions that protected knowledge failed. Funding faltered, political priorities shifted, religious tensions hardened, administrative continuity broke. And when that happened, the accumulated work of generations became vulnerable. This is the first hard truth Alexandria teaches. Knowledge is not self-sustaining. It requires active protection. The counterfactual question, what if the Library of Alexandria never burned down, forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that such survival would have required deliberate, repeated choices across centuries. It would have required rulers to value long-term intellectual investment over short-term political gain. It would have required religious authorities to tolerate ambiguity. It would have required societies to see knowledge as a public good rather than an elite ornament. Those conditions are rare, even today. This is why Alexandria resonates so powerfully in modern imagination. It embodies not only lost wisdom, but lost continuity. It reminds us that civilization is not a straight line upward, but a precarious balancing act between memory and neglect. When modern historians reassess the burning of the library, they often emphasize that there was no single catastrophic fire. This corrective is important, but it risks missing the point. The tragedy of Alexandria was not sudden destruction. It was slow indifference. Scrolls decayed because they were not recopied. Scholars departed because stipends vanished. Buildings crumbled because maintenance ceased. Knowledge did not disappear violently, it faded quietly. This is how most civilizations forget. Which brings us to the deeper counterfactual. If Alexandria had survived, it would not be because it was invincible. It would be because societies repeatedly chose to renew it, to see value in preserving the past, even when the present felt urgent. That choice is difficult. It offers no immediate reward. And yet, every major leap in human understanding depends on it. The Renaissance was not miraculous. It was archival. It happened because medieval and Islamic scholars preserved texts long enough for later generations to rediscover them. The scientific revolution did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from accumulated fragments, patiently reassembled. Alexandria represents a world where that reassembly might not have been necessary, but it also represents a warning. Even the most ambitious intellectual projects can fail if they are not woven into the fabric of society itself. This is why modern institutions, universities, libraries, archives, research centers are Alexandria's true descendants, and they face the same risks: funding cuts, political interference, cultural suspicion of expertise, the devaluation of slow, cumulative work in favor of immediate results. We often tell ourselves that digital technology has solved the problem of preservation, that information stored electronically cannot be lost in the way papyrus scrolls were lost. This is a comforting illusion. Digital data requires infrastructure, energy, maintenance, and institutional will. Without those, it vanishes just as surely, sometimes faster. Formats become obsolete, servers fail, context disappears. Alexandria's lesson applies as strongly now as it did 2,000 years ago. Knowledge survives only where societies decide it should, which reframes our original question one final time. What if the Library of Alexandria never burned down? Perhaps the more important question is, what kind of civilization would have been capable of keeping it alive? The answer is not simply a more rational one or a more enlightened one. It is a civilization willing to think beyond the lifespan of individual rulers, ideologies, and even religions. A civilization willing to accept uncertainty. A civilization that understands that knowledge is not dangerous because it challenges beliefs, but dangerous when it is lost, fragmented, or monopolized. Alexandria, at its best, embodied that understanding. It gathered voices from different cultures. It preserved competing theories. It treated disagreement as productive rather than threatening. It assumed that truth emerged from comparison, not decree. That assumption remains radical, even today. In the end, imagining Alexandria's survival is not really about rewriting ancient history. It is about interrogating our own. We live in a world with unprecedented access to information and unprecedented vulnerability to misinformation, polarization, and institutional decay. We celebrate innovation, but undervalue preservation. We fund breakthroughs, but neglect maintenance. Alexandria reminds us that civilization does not collapse only through invasion or catastrophe. It collapses when it stops caring about remembering. If the Library of Alexandria had survived, the world might have reached certain insights earlier. Science might have matured differently. Empires might have behaved more predictably or more efficiently. Environmental consequences might have emerged sooner. But none of those outcomes were guaranteed to be better. What Alexandria truly offered was not certainty. It offered continuity. And continuity is the rarest achievement of all. To preserve knowledge across centuries requires humility, the recognition that future generations matter as much as present ones, and that the work we inherit is not ours to consume, but to steward. That is the quiet, unsettling power of Alexandria's legacy. Not that it was lost, but that it was possible, and that its loss was a choice repeated many times. The question it leaves us with is not hypothetical, it is immediate. What knowledge are we failing to protect today? And will future generations ask the same question of us? In the end, the Library of Alexandria does not demand that we imagine a world of flying machines in antiquity or telescopes rising above Roman temples. It does not require us to believe that humanity missed a guaranteed golden age or that progress was stolen by a single act of destruction. Its question is far quieter and far more difficult, because when we strip away the myth of a single fire and confront the historical reality, Alexandria stops being a tragedy imposed from outside. It becomes a mirror. The library did not fall because knowledge was weak. It fell because commitment to knowledge was conditional. As dynasties changed, budgets shifted. As political instability grew, priorities narrowed. As religious certainty hardened, intellectual pluralism became uncomfortable. No one needed to hate knowledge for Alexandria to fade. They only needed to stop actively sustaining it. This is the part of the story that resonates most sharply with the present. We live in a world that produces more information in a day than Alexandria gathered in centuries. Our archives are vast, our technologies powerful, our institutions global, and yet the same vulnerabilities remain. Funding for research rises and falls with political winds. Expertise is alternately celebrated and dismissed. Universities are pressured to justify themselves in economic terms alone. Libraries close quietly. Archives are digitized without long-term preservation plans. Context is lost faster than data is created. Alexandria reminds us that abundance does not equal security. What made the ancient library extraordinary was not merely the number of scrolls it held, but the social agreement that those scrolls mattered, that preserving, comparing, and questioning them was a public good worth sustained investment. That agreement eroded. And when it did, no single ruler, army, or ideology needed to destroy the library. Time finished the work. This is the deeper answer to our original question. If the Library of Alexandria had never burned down, it would be because generation after generation chose to protect it, not out of nostalgia, but out of responsibility. The survival of knowledge is always an ethical decision. It requires societies to value slow accumulation over immediate reward. It requires tolerance for uncertainty and disagreement. It requires humility, the recognition that future thinkers will see further, not because they are wiser, but because they stand on foundations they did not build. Alexandria embodied that humility imperfectly, but sincerely. Its scholars knew they were inheritors as much as innovators. They copied texts, not to glorify the past, but to make it usable. They debated not to win, but to refine understanding. They preserved multiple viewpoints because they accepted that certainty was provisional. That attitude is fragile. It is far easier to demand answers than to sustain questions, far easier to fund spectacle than maintenance, far easier to declare knowledge settled than to admit it remains incomplete. When civilizations lose patience with inquiry, Alexandria happens, not suddenly, gradually. So what, then, would a world shaped by an unbroken Alexandrian tradition truly look like? It would not be a world without conflict, hierarchy, or suffering. It would not be a world without misuse of knowledge or abuse of power. Human nature would not be transformed by libraries alone, but it might be a world more accustomed to continuity, a world less shocked by new ideas because disagreement was normal. A world less prone to intellectual amnesia because preservation was routine. A world where progress felt less like rupture and more like inheritance. In such a world, the future would not appear as a constant break from the past, but as its extension. This, perhaps, is the most profound loss Alexandria represents. Not lost inventions, but lost confidence that civilization can remember itself. When modern thinkers lament Alexandria, they often do so nostalgically, as if ancient wisdom were purer, deeper, or more unified than our own. This is a mistake. Ancient knowledge was incomplete, often wrong, and shaped by its own blind spots. What made Alexandria remarkable was not perfection, it was persistence. It was the belief that understanding grows through time, that no single generation holds the final word, and that safeguarding the conditions for inquiry is more important than any single conclusion. That belief is always under threat, which means Alexandria is not behind us. It is in front of us. Every decision about education, research, archives, and intellectual freedom echoes the same question Alexandria leaves unanswered. Are we building institutions meant to last beyond ourselves, or merely using knowledge until it becomes inconvenient? The Library of Alexandria never burned down in a single moment. It faded because enough people, for long enough, chose other priorities. If it had survived, it would not be because history was kinder. It would be because humanity was more patient. And patience, more than brilliance, is what sustains civilization. So perhaps the most honest answer to "What if the Library of Alexandria never burned down?" is this: the world would not be transformed by what we knew. It would be transformed by how seriously we took the act of remembering. And that question, whether we are capable of such seriousness, remains unresolved. Not in the past, but now. One of the most powerful myths in popular history is the idea of a long interruption, a world that knew how to think, then forgot, a civilization that reached heights of understanding, then collapsed into darkness, 1,000 years of silence between antiquity and modernity. Historians today rightly challenge this image. The so-called Dark Ages were not dark everywhere, nor were they devoid of learning. Knowledge survived in monasteries, in courts, in Islamic cities, in Byzantine schools. Yet the persistence of the myth tells us something important. It reflects a real rupture in continuity. If the Library of Alexandria had never declined, if its institutional model had survived, the very structure of history might feel different to us. Not because the Middle Ages would suddenly look modern, but because they would not appear as a gap. They would appear as a middle. In our actual timeline, much of medieval intellectual life was defined by recovery. Texts were searched for, translated, reconciled, debated as newly rediscovered authorities. Scholars worked backward as much as forward. Enormous energy was spent reconstructing foundations that had once existed. A surviving Alexandria would have altered this dynamic fundamentally. Instead of recovery, there would be transmission. Instead of rediscovery, inheritance. Instead of sharp discontinuities between ancient and medieval, we might see gradual transformation, ideas adapting to new religious, political, and social realities without losing their methodological core. This matters because continuity shapes confidence. When societies experience repeated intellectual collapse, they grow cautious. They privilege authority over experimentation. They treat inherited knowledge as fragile, sacred, and easily lost. This tendency was visible throughout medieval Europe, where texts were revered not only for their content, but for their rarity. In a world with continuous Alexandrian institutions, knowledge would be abundant by comparison, not universally accessible, but stable enough to be questioned without fear of loss. That stability changes behavior. Scholars argue differently when they know disagreement will not erase memory. They challenge authorities more readily when alternative texts are available. They innovate more confidently when failure does not mean oblivion. Nowhere is this more apparent than in theology. In our history, medieval theology became the dominant intellectual framework, partly because it offered stability in a fragmented world. It preserved texts, trained scholars, and imposed coherence. Natural philosophy survived within it, but under constraints. If Alexandrian scientific institutions had endured, theology would not need to carry that burden alone. It would be one system among others, not the sole custodian of learning. This does not imply secular dominance. It implies pluralism. Christian, Islamic, Jewish, and philosophical traditions would coexist within a shared scholarly ecosystem inherited from antiquity. Debates about nature, causality, and morality would occur inside institutions already accustomed to disagreement. The result would not be consensus, it would be normalization of conflict, and normalization of conflict is one of the most important preconditions for intellectual progress. Consider law. Roman law survived in fragments and was later rediscovered and systematized in medieval Europe. This rediscovery shaped governance profoundly, providing a foundation for bureaucratic states. In a continuous Alexandrian world, legal theory might evolve alongside philosophy and science without interruption. Comparative legal traditions, Roman, Hellenistic, Near Eastern, could be studied systematically, not sporadically. Governance itself might become more analytical earlier, not more democratic necessarily, but more procedural. States that rely on written law, records, and trained administrators govern differently from those that rely on personal authority and tradition. This would reshape medieval politics. Feudalism might still emerge, driven by military realities and land ownership, but its intellectual justification would be more contested. Competing models of governance would circulate. Centralization and decentralization would be debated with reference to historical precedent and empirical outcomes. Even economic thought would change. Ancient writers already explored money, value, exchange, and scarcity. These ideas were later revived unevenly. A continuous Alexandrian tradition could preserve and expand them, allowing economic theory to mature earlier, not as abstract mathematics, but as reflection on real administrative practice. Markets would still exist, inequality would persist, but the language to analyze them would be older. This leads us to an often overlooked consequence of continuity: historical self-awareness. Civilizations with access to long archives develop a sense of pattern. They recognize cycles of rise and decline, not as myths, but as recorded experience. They become cautious, not because they fear change, but because they understand consequence. Alexandria was uniquely positioned to cultivate this awareness. It preserved not only scientific texts, but histories, geographies, ethnographies. It compared civilizations rather than isolating them. It treated the past as data. If that tradition had survived, medieval societies might have seen themselves not as living after antiquity, but within it, participants in an ongoing story rather than heirs to ruins. This would alter cultural psychology profoundly. Renaissance thinkers spoke of rebirth because they believed something essential had died. In a world without that perceived death, intellectual ambition might be quieter, steadier, less theatrical. Progress would feel less like salvation and more like responsibility. But continuity has its dangers. Societies deeply embedded in tradition can become conservative. Institutions that endure too long can ossify. Alexandria itself risked this. Its reverence for classical texts sometimes slowed radical departure. A surviving library would face constant tension between preservation and innovation. Yet that tension is healthier than rupture, because rupture forces reinvention under pressure, often without awareness of alternatives. The medieval world we know was resilient and creative precisely because it had to be. It adapted under scarcity of knowledge. A continuous Alexandrian world would adapt under abundance. Which is harder? Abundance demands discernment. Scarcity demands reverence. Human societies often manage scarcity better than abundance. This suggests a sobering possibility. A world without a lost millennium might advance earlier in some domains, but struggle more in others. Intellectual humility, born of knowing how much has been forgotten, might be weaker. Confidence might shade into complacency. Alexandria's survival would not guarantee wisdom, it would guarantee memory. And memory changes the texture of time. History would feel less broken, but not necessarily kinder. As we move forward in this thought experiment, the question becomes sharper. If the long middle of history were continuous rather than fractured, how would modernity itself emerge? Would there even be a recognizable modern age, or would change be so gradual that the idea loses meaning? To answer that, we must follow this uninterrupted current into the early modern world and ask how science, technology, and society transform when there is no dramatic rebirth, only slow accumulation. The Renaissance, as it is commonly told, begins with rediscovery. Ancient texts reappear. Greek returns to Western Europe. Roman law is recovered. Classical art and philosophy are revived after centuries of neglect. The story is dramatic because it is framed as resurrection, a civilization remembering what it once knew. But this drama depends on loss. If the Library of Alexandria and the institutional culture it represented had never declined, the Renaissance would lose its defining feature. There would be nothing to rediscover because nothing essential would have been forgotten. This does not mean Europe would stagnate. It means that modernity would emerge without a restart button. In our actual history, the Renaissance was fueled by shock. Scholars encountered ancient texts not as familiar tools, but as revelations. Ideas appeared fully formed, demanding explanation. Why had Aristotle been so systematic? Why had Archimedes reasoned so precisely? Why did ancient astronomers seem closer to the truth than medieval authorities? These questions generated urgency. They pushed thinkers to reconcile contradictions quickly, sometimes violently. They encouraged bold departures because the past appeared suddenly more sophisticated than the present. In a continuous Alexandrian world, this urgency would be absent. Progress would be incremental, not theatrical, and that changes the character of innovation. Take perspective in art. In our timeline, linear perspective emerged in 15th century Italy as artists studied ancient geometry and optics. The rediscovery of Euclid and Ptolemy helped formalize visual representation. Perspective appeared revolutionary because its mathematical basis felt newly revealed. In a world with continuous Alexandrian transmission, such principles would never vanish. Artistic techniques based on geometry would evolve gradually. There would be no sudden leap from medieval flatness to Renaissance depth, only refinement. Art would still change, but it would not astonish. The same applies to science. Copernicus shocked his contemporaries because heliocentrism appeared as a radical break from tradition. It disrupted not only astronomy, but theology and cosmology. Resistance was fierce, precisely because the idea felt foreign. If Alexandrian astronomy had continued uninterrupted, heliocentric debate would be ancient. Models would shift slowly as evidence accumulated. When the Earth finally lost its central position, it would do so quietly. No trial, no scandal, no revolution. This quietness has consequences. Dramatic revolutions galvanize attention. They attract patrons, provoke resistance, and reshape institutions rapidly. Gradual change, by contrast, can be overlooked. It spreads thinly, unevenly, without the symbolic force that mobilizes societies. A world without a Renaissance might be more stable, but also less self-aware of transformation. Modernity, as a concept, depends on contrast with the past. Without a perceived dark age, the sense of having crossed a threshold weakens. People may not feel modern at all, only continuous. This affects identity. Renaissance Europeans defined themselves by rebirth, by conscious departure from medieval constraints. That self-conception fueled exploration, experimentation, and ambition. It justified risk-taking. In a world of continuity, ambition must justify itself differently. Innovation would arise from problem-solving rather than ideological renewal. States would invest in research to improve administration, warfare, trade, not to reclaim lost greatness. This might produce fewer symbolic figures like Leonardo da Vinci or Galileo, individuals celebrated as bridges between worlds. Instead, progress would be attributed to institutions, not heroes. This is not a loss, but it changes cultural memory. Now consider printing. The printing press is often described as a catalyst of modernity because it broke the monopoly of manuscript culture and accelerated the spread of ideas. Its impact was revolutionary because it arrived in a world starved for texts. If Alexandrian-style institutions had preserved and circulated knowledge continuously, manuscript culture would still dominate, but it would be denser, more standardized, and more accessible. Printing would still matter, but its impact would be evolutionary, not explosive. Texts would multiply faster, but they would enter an already literate, already scholarly ecosystem. The sudden destabilization of authority caused by print, pamphlets, polemics, mass dissent might be less severe. Religious reform, too, might look different. The Protestant Reformation was driven partly by access to texts and frustration with centralized authority that controlled interpretation. In a world where textual criticism and pluralism were long normalized, reform movements might emerge earlier, but also fragment less violently. Doctrinal disagreement would be familiar territory. This does not eliminate conflict, but it may reduce surprise. The modern world as we know it was born in shock. Sudden discoveries, sudden expansions, sudden contradictions between belief and observation. That shock produced creativity, but also trauma. Colonialism, for example, expanded rapidly because Europe suddenly possessed navigational, military, and economic advantages that others did not. This imbalance was intensified by the suddenness of development. In a world of continuous knowledge transmission, imbalances would still exist, but they might develop more gradually. Other regions would not be caught unprepared by technologies that appeared without precedent. Global contact might be slower, but less asymmetric. Again, this is not a promise of justice. It is a shift in tempo. Tempo matters. Fast change overwhelms institutions. Slow change allows adaptation. A world without a Renaissance might be less dramatic, but potentially more resilient. Yet there is a final paradox. Rebirth narratives inspire preservation. Europe preserved ancient texts precisely because it believed they were lost and precious. Renaissance humanists copied obsessively, translated fervently, and archived deliberately. In a world where knowledge never seemed endangered, would preservation be taken for granted? Alexandria itself suggests the danger. Its early success bred confidence. That confidence allowed complacency. and complacency over centuries proved fatal. This suggests that rupture, however costly, can renew vigilance. Civilizations that experience loss often become better archivists. Civilizations that assume continuity sometimes forget to protect it. So the absence of a renaissance might also mean the absence of a preservation panic, a moment when societies consciously decide to save their past. In that sense, the Renaissance was not merely a rediscovery. It was an awakening to fragility. A world without Alexandria's loss might need another lesson to learn that fragility. And history is unforgiving in how it teaches. As we move toward the modern era in this alternate timeline, the question becomes sharper still. If progress is gradual, institutions are stable, and knowledge accumulates without drama. What happens when disruption finally arrives? Because disruption always arrives. The next batch must confront that inevitability. The moment when even continuous knowledge meets forces it cannot easily absorb: industrialization, mass society, and global scale. Industrialization is often treated as an accident of genius, a cluster of inventions, a fortunate geography, a handful of clever minds. Steam engines, coal, iron, factories. Suddenly, the world changes. But industrialization was not born from invention alone. It emerged from accumulated understanding, mechanics refined over centuries, mathematics applied systematically, chemistry disentangled from alchemy, and, most importantly, institutions capable of coordinating knowledge at scale. This is where a surviving Alexandrian tradition would matter most. In our history, industrialization arrived abruptly because knowledge had been fragmented for so long. When scientific principles finally converged, thermodynamics, material science, mechanical engineering, they did so in a compressed time frame. Society was unprepared for the speed of change. A world without Alexandrian amnesia would encounter industrial power differently, not necessarily earlier, but more knowingly. Alexandrian scholars already understood the importance of abstraction. They modeled nature mathematically. They separated principle from application. What they lacked was sustained application across generations. If that abstraction had matured continuously, the theoretical foundations of industry, energy, force, efficiency, would be well understood long before machines were scaled massively. This matters because industrialization is not dangerous because it exists. It is dangerous because it outruns comprehension. In 18th century Europe, steam power exploded into society faster than moral, political, and ecological frameworks could adapt. The result was exploitation, urban collapse, child labor, environmental degradation, costs that were recognized only after damage was done. A continuous Alexandrian tradition would not prevent these outcomes, but it would contextualize them. Engineers trained in long traditions of natural philosophy might ask different questions, not, "Can this be built?" but, "What does this disrupt?" Such questions were already present in ancient ethics, but they lacked technological urgency. Now imagine them applied to industry. The result might be slower deployment, more incremental scaling, greater emphasis on regulation, not out of compassion, but out of prudence. States governed by educated bureaucracies tend to fear instability more than stagnation. They regulate early, not late. This could profoundly alter labor history. Industrial capitalism, as it emerged, treated labor as expendable because workers were plentiful and politically powerless. Earlier educational diffusion, rooted in Alexandrian continuity, might produce a more literate workforce earlier. Literate populations resist exploitation differently. They organize, petition, and record grievances. This does not abolish inequality, but it alters negotiation. Environmental impact would follow a similar pattern. Ancient philosophers understood limits. Stoics spoke of living according to nature. Aristotle emphasized balance. These ideas were ethical, not ecological, but they could evolve. In our timeline, ecological awareness lagged behind industrial damage by centuries. In a world with uninterrupted natural philosophy, early warning signs might be recognized sooner, not to prevent damage entirely, but to frame it as a systemic problem rather than an isolated inconvenience. Alexandria's greatest strength was synthesis. It connected astronomy to mathematics, medicine to biology, mechanics to geometry. Industrial society suffered because it separated these domains, engineering divorced from ethics, production divorced from consequence. A continuous Alexandrian mindset would resist such fragmentation, not perfectly, but persistently. Now consider political power. Industrialization strengthened states that could mobilize resources efficiently. Bureaucracy, surveillance, and logistics expanded. In our history, these systems developed reactively, often justified after abuse. In a world with centuries of administrative science, governance might evolve more deliberately. Census-taking, taxation, public works, and health systems would be understood as interconnected rather than improvised. This does not guarantee justice, but it encourages foresight. The modern nation-state might emerge earlier, not as an authoritarian machine, but as a rationalized system balancing extraction with stability. Global inequality would still exist, but it might develop along different lines. In our world, Europe surged ahead because others lacked comparable scientific infrastructure at the moment of industrial breakthrough. In a continuous Alexandrian world, scientific capacity would be more evenly distributed across regions connected by long-standing scholarly networks. No single region would monopolize industrial power so completely. Colonialism, if it occurs, would encounter resistance from societies already literate in science, law, and administration. Exploitation would be contested not only militarily but intellectually. This could limit its scale or transform its form. Once again, tempo matters. Gradual industrialization allows institutions to adapt. Sudden industrialization overwhelms them. Alexandria's survival would not eliminate disruption, but it would stretch it across time. Yet there is an irony here. Slow change is harder to perceive. Without dramatic crises, societies may fail to mobilize reform. Exploitation can persist quietly. Environmental damage can accumulate unnoticed. Gradual harm lacks urgency. This is the paradox of continuity. It reduces shock, but it can also dull awareness, which means even in this alternate world, reckoning would eventually arrive. No civilization escapes the moment when accumulated systems collide with limits, ecological, social, moral. The difference lies in preparedness. Industrial society without amnesia would still face crises, but it would face them with deeper memory. It would know that civilizations have overreached before, that knowledge systems have collapsed before, that ignoring long-term consequences has always carried costs. Alexandria would not save humanity from industrial trauma, but it might ensure that trauma is recognized as pattern rather than accident. That recognition changes response. As we move toward the final phase of this thought experiment, we must confront the most difficult question of all. If Alexandria had survived, would humanity actually be wiser or merely more powerful? The answer depends not on science or industry, but on something far harder to preserve than texts: moral continuity. Every civilization that accumulates power eventually faces the same test, not whether it can discover more, build more, or control more, but whether it can understand the consequences of doing so. The survival of the Library of Alexandria would almost certainly accelerate humanity's technical and administrative capabilities, but it leaves open a more troubling question. Would ethical wisdom evolve at the same pace, or would knowledge once again outstrip restraint? Ancient Alexandria did not separate ethics from inquiry. Philosophers debated physics and metaphysics alongside questions of virtue, purpose, and justice. Science was not imagined as morally neutral. It was embedded in broader conversations about how humans ought to live. This integration mattered. When later societies inherited fragments of ancient science without its ethical context, technical knowledge often became detached from moral reasoning. Engineering advanced faster than reflection, power accumulated faster than responsibility. A continuous Alexandrian tradition might have resisted that separation. But resistance is not immunity. Ethics evolves differently from technology. It depends on culture, experience, suffering, and collective memory. Technical knowledge can be formalized and transmitted efficiently. Moral wisdom resists codification. It must be relearned repeatedly in new contexts. Alexandria could preserve texts. It could not preserve humility. Consider warfare. Ancient philosophers debated just war, limits of violence, and the responsibilities of rulers. Yet ancient states still waged brutal campaigns. Knowledge of ethics did not restrain ambition. It provided language for justification. In a world where scientific knowledge advances earlier, military capability would also advance earlier. States would face moral questions sooner about proportionality, civilian harm, technological escalation. Would ethical debate keep pace? Possibly, but history suggests otherwise. Ethics often lags behind practice, responding to harm after it occurs. It codifies lessons learned through failure. An Alexandrian world might experience those failures earlier. That does not make it worse, but it makes it no safer. Now consider economic power. Earlier scientific administration would increase efficiency in taxation, agriculture, and trade. Wealth would concentrate more predictably. Philosophers might debate justice and distribution, but states would still prioritize stability and revenue. Without political institutions designed to translate ethical insight into policy, moral philosophy remains advisory. Alexandria influenced rulers. It did not govern. This distinction is critical. Ethical wisdom shapes outcomes only when embedded in power structures. Without mechanisms for accountability, even the most refined moral reasoning can be ignored. Ancient Alexandria lacked democratic institutions in the modern sense. Its scholars depended on patronage. Their influence rose and fell with political favor. A surviving library would still face this constraint, which suggests that wisdom would not automatically keep pace with knowledge unless institutions evolved to enforce ethical reflection structurally. Could that happen earlier? Possibly. Continuous scholarship might normalize ethical review of policy. Philosophers might be consulted routinely. Laws might incorporate long-term reasoning. Bureaucracies might value foresight. But none of this is guaranteed. Modern societies, with centuries of ethical theory behind them, still struggle to align power with principle. Alexandria's survival would not solve this. It would only make the problem visible sooner. And visibility matters. When societies lack language for ethical analysis, harm goes unnamed. When they possess such language, harm becomes contestable. Alexandria's greatest ethical contribution might therefore be not solutions, but vocabulary. A shared language to debate responsibility, consequence, and restraint. That alone is transformative, because once harm can be articulated clearly, it can be resisted, even if imperfectly. Now consider environmental ethics. Ancient philosophy emphasized balance and moderation, but lacked ecological science. A continuous Alexandrian tradition might integrate observation of environmental degradation into ethical discourse earlier, not to prevent damage, but to recognize systemic harm rather than treating it as isolated misfortune. This recognition could influence policy slowly. Forestry management, water regulation, urban planning, agricultural rotation. Small interventions accumulate. Ethical wisdom does not need perfection to matter. It needs continuity. Yet continuity cuts both ways. Long-standing ethical frameworks can also justify injustice. Slavery persisted for millennia alongside philosophical debate. Gender hierarchy survived centuries of reflection. Moral systems often rationalize existing power. Alexandria would inherit these blind spots. It would not transcend them automatically. Which brings us to the hardest truth of all. The survival of the Library of Alexandria would not produce a wiser humanity by default. It would produce a humanity with fewer excuses for ignorance, fewer excuses for repeating mistakes, fewer excuses for short-term thinking. That does not guarantee better choices, but it increases responsibility. In our world, we often attribute harm to ignorance, accident, or inevitability. In an Alexandrian continuous world, many harms would be recognized as choices made despite knowledge. This changes moral judgment. History would be harsher. Civilizations would be judged not only by what they did not know, but by what they chose to ignore. That judgment applied earlier might shape behavior, or it might simply sharpen condemnation. There is no certainty here. But there is clarity. The Library of Alexandria symbolizes the possibility that knowledge and ethics could grow together, not because humans are virtuous, but because institutions make reflection unavoidable. Its loss delayed that confrontation. Its survival would accelerate it. As we approach the end of this thought experiment, we must ask one final structural question. If Alexandria had endured, if knowledge accumulated continuously, if ethics evolved alongside power, what would humanity understand about itself? Not technologically, but historically. Would we see ourselves as progressing or merely recurring? That question leads us into the penultimate stage of our journey. Civilizations rarely fail because they lack intelligence. They fail because they forget. They forget why institutions were built. They forget the conditions that made prosperity possible. They forget the cost of past mistakes. And when memory erodes, societies repeat patterns they no longer recognize as familiar. The most radical consequence of the Library of Alexandria's survival would not be earlier technology or smoother progress. It would be something far more subtle and far more powerful, a civilization capable of remembering itself. Alexandria was, at its core, an archive of experience, not merely scientific formulas or philosophical arguments, but records of how humans had tried to understand the world before. It preserved disagreement. It preserved failure. It preserved ideas that had lost political favor but retained intellectual value. This kind of memory changes how societies interpret crisis. In our history, periods of upheaval, plagues, economic collapse, climate stress, political fragmentation were often experienced as unprecedented disasters. Lacking long institutional memory, societies responded with fear, superstition, or violent reassertion of authority. A civilization shaped by uninterrupted Alexandrian continuity would experience crisis differently, not calmly, but knowingly. It would recognize patterns. Alexandrian historians and geographers already compared civilizations across time and space. They studied how empires rose and fell, how cities expanded and declined, how trade networks shifted, how climates influenced agriculture. These observations were not predictive in the modern sense, but they were comparative. If preserved and expanded, this habit of comparison could mature into something resembling historical systems thinking. Societies would not merely react to collapse, they would contextualize it. This does not eliminate panic or suffering, but it reframes them. Crisis becomes recurrence rather than apocalypse. That framing alone alters response. Consider famine. In ancient and medieval history, famine was often treated as divine punishment or unavoidable fate. Relief efforts were improvised. Memory of past famines rarely translated into institutional prevention. A continuous Alexandrian tradition linking climate observation, agricultural science, logistics, and administration might recognize famine as a systemic failure rather than a moral judgment. Grain reserves, price controls, transportation infrastructure, and early warning systems could emerge gradually, not because rulers are benevolent, but because institutional memory makes prevention rational. The same applies to disease. Alexandrian medicine already emphasized observation and classification. If that tradition had continued, epidemiological thinking might emerge earlier. Plagues would still occur, but responses might be informed by accumulated data rather than desperation. This is not speculation. Modern public health works precisely because it remembers past outbreaks. Alexandria offered the seed of that memory. Now consider political collapse. Empires often fail when they cannot adapt to scale. Administration lags behind territory. Corruption spreads, legitimacy erodes. These processes are slow, but often invisible to those living through them. A civilization with deep historical archives would see warning signs earlier. Not to prevent collapse entirely, but to manage it. Decentralization could be planned rather than chaotic. Succession could be institutionalized rather than contested violently. Reform could occur incrementally rather than through revolution. This changes the rhythm of history. Revolutions might still happen, but they would be rarer and less mythologized. In our world, revolution is often romanticized because it feels like renewal after stagnation. In a world with continuity, stagnation might be addressed earlier, reducing the emotional appeal of total rupture. This does not eliminate injustice, it changes how injustice is confronted. Memory also shapes identity. Modern societies often define themselves against the past, modern versus medieval, enlightened versus primitive. This binary thinking simplifies complexity and justifies dismissal. A civilization that remembers itself does not need to reject its past to move forward. It can criticize without erasure. Alexandria modeled this attitude. Its scholars did not destroy earlier texts to replace them. They annotated, corrected, compared. Homer was not discarded, he was edited. Aristotle was not worshipped, he was debated. This habit fosters intellectual humility, not because people become modest, but because evidence of past error is preserved. When mistakes are archived, arrogance is harder to sustain. Now consider long-term planning. Modern societies struggle to plan beyond decades. Infrastructure decays. Environmental damage accumulates. Political incentives favor short-term success. Alexandria's existence implied a longer horizon. Libraries are built for centuries, not election cycles. A civilization accustomed to maintaining institutions across generations might normalize long-term thinking. Projects spanning decades, or centuries, would feel plausible rather than utopian. This does not guarantee wise outcomes, but it expands the time frame of responsibility. Humanity's most destructive decisions often occur when consequences are distant or invisible. Memory collapses distance, yet memory also creates burden. A civilization that remembers itself cannot escape guilt easily. It cannot pretend ignorance. It must live with awareness of past failures. This awareness can paralyze, or it can mature. Alexandria's survival would test which response dominates. Would humanity use memory to justify resignation? We have always failed, or to refine action. We know how this ends? The answer is not fixed, but the question itself is transformative. The tragedy of Alexandria's loss is not that humanity became ignorant. It is that humanity became forgetful. Forgetful of methods, forgetful of alternatives, forgetful that knowledge once flowed more continuously than it later appeared. This forgetfulness shaped modern myths of progress, that history moves forward through genius alone, that collapse is total, that rebirth is necessary. A civilization that remembers itself would tell different stories. It would speak less of golden ages and dark ages, and more of accumulation and erosion, less of heroes and villains, and more of systems and choices, less of inevitability and more of responsibility. This brings us to the final threshold of our exploration. If the Library of Alexandria had never burned down, if humanity had retained continuous memory, how would it understand its future? Not as destiny, but as stewardship. That question defines the closing movement of this documentary. To imagine a future shaped by the uninterrupted survival of the Library of Alexandria is not to imagine perfection, it is to imagine accountability. A civilization that remembers itself cannot claim innocence easily. It cannot say, "We did not know," or "No one could have foreseen this." Memory removes that refuge. Knowledge accumulated across centuries transforms ignorance from condition into choice. This is Alexandria's final, unsettling gift. If its tradition had endured, if scientific, philosophical, and historical memory flowed continuously, humanity would approach the future differently. Not with confidence, but with gravity. In our actual world, the future often appears abstract. Climate change, technological disruption, artificial intelligence, ecological collapse, these are framed as unprecedented challenges. Their novelty becomes both motivation and excuse. Because they feel new, societies delay responsibility. A world shaped by Alexandrian continuity would recognize a pattern: technological acceleration, resource strain, ethical lag, institutional mismatch. These are not new phenomena, they are recurring ones. Alexandrian scholars already observed how innovations destabilized societies, how wealth concentration eroded civic cohesion, how empires exhausted their environments. They lacked modern data, but they recognized dynamics. If those observations had been preserved, expanded, and institutionalized, the future would feel less mysterious, still dangerous, but less surprising. This recognition would not eliminate risk. It would sharpen foresight. The future would not be approached as destiny, but as consequence. This distinction matters profoundly. Societies that believe the future is inevitable act reactively. Societies that believe the future is constructed act deliberately. Alexandria's survival would encourage the latter mindset, not because humans become wiser, but because memory exposes causation. Now consider technological power. Modern societies often celebrate innovation as inherently good. New capabilities are pursued because they are possible. Ethical evaluation follows later, if at all. An Alexandrian-informed civilization might reverse that order. Not halt innovation, but integrate foresight earlier. This would not eliminate misuse of technology, but it would normalize the expectation that new power demands justification, not merely admiration. Scientific institutions might include ethical councils not as afterthoughts, but as standard components, descendants of philosophical debate embedded in research culture. Again, this is not utopian. It is procedural. Alexandria's legacy is not virtue. It is structure. Now consider global coordination. One of humanity's greatest modern challenges is scale. Problems cross borders. Institutions remain national. Coordination lags behind consequence. Alexandria offers a clue. It was one of the earliest genuinely international intellectual projects. It gathered knowledge from Egypt, Greece, Persia, India, Babylon. It translated rather than assimilated. It preserved difference rather than erasing it. If this model had endured, global cooperation in knowledge might feel older, more legitimate, less threatening. International scientific institutions would not appear as modern inventions imposed by elites, but as heirs to ancient precedent. Trust, in this sense, depends on memory. People trust institutions that feel continuous. Discontinuous systems feel artificial. This has implications for governance of shared threats: climate, oceans, space, data. A civilization raised on Alexandrian continuity might accept global stewardship not as loss of sovereignty, but as inheritance of responsibility. Once again, not guaranteed, but plausible. There is, however, a deeper implication. A future without amnesia would be a future without comforting illusions. Progress would not be mistaken for moral improvement. Intelligence would not be confused with wisdom. Growth would not be equated automatically with good. History would be present constantly, not as nostalgia, but as constraint. This might slow decision-making, it might frustrate ambition, but it would reduce recklessness. Recklessness thrives where memory is thin. Alexandria's survival would thicken memory, and thick memory changes how people imagine success. Success becomes less about dominance and more about durability, not how fast something is built, but how long it lasts, not how powerful a system becomes, but how resilient it remains. These values are rare in human history. They are rarely rewarded politically. Which brings us to the most difficult realization of all. If the Library of Alexandria had never declined, humanity would face higher standards, not lower ones. Mistakes would be judged more harshly because ignorance would be less credible. Atrocities would be harder to excuse. Environmental destruction would be recognized as repetition, not novelty. History would weigh heavier. This burden might provoke resistance. Some societies might reject memory deliberately. They might burn archives not out of hatred for knowledge, but to escape responsibility. This, too, has precedent. The survival of Alexandria would not end forgetting. It would make forgetting an act, not an accident. And that distinction is everything. We often imagine lost knowledge as tragic because it limits what humanity can do. Alexandria suggests a more troubling possibility. Perhaps forgetting is sometimes convenient. Perhaps civilizations lose memory because remembering demands restraint. If Alexandria had survived, humanity would be forced to confront its patterns earlier, more often, and with fewer excuses. That confrontation could foster maturity, or it could provoke denial. History offers examples of both, which means the ultimate impact of Alexandria's survival would not be technological or scientific. It would be psychological. It would reshape how humanity understands time, not as a series of disconnected eras, but as a continuous process in which actions echo far beyond intention. That understanding is rare, it is uncomfortable, and it is precisely what Alexandria represented. As we reach the final batch of this documentary, we must let go of counterfactual speculation and return to the present. Because the question, what if the Library of Alexandria never burned down, is not really about the past. It is about what we choose to preserve now. In the end, the Library of Alexandria does not belong to the past. It belongs to the present. This is the final and perhaps most unsettling realization that emerges when we follow the question all the way through, beyond speculation, beyond alternate timelines, beyond imagined inventions and delayed revolutions. The Library of Alexandria was never simply a building filled with scrolls. It was a decision to gather knowledge from everywhere rather than guard it locally. A decision to preserve disagreement rather than enforce consensus. A decision to invest in learning whose value would not be immediate. A decision to think beyond a single reign, a single generation, even a single culture. Its loss was not the result of one dramatic moment of destruction. It was the cumulative outcome of many smaller decisions not to renew that commitment, funding not restored, scholars not replaced, texts not recopied, institutions not defended when they became inconvenient. Alexandria did not fall because humanity rejected knowledge. It fell because humanity stopped prioritizing it. This distinction matters more than any counterfactual outcome we have explored, because it means that the question, what if the Library of Alexandria never burned down, is not a question about fire, conquest, or fate. It is a question about values. Every generation inherits knowledge it did not create. Whether that knowledge survives depends on whether each generation chooses to become a steward rather than merely a consumer. Alexandria asked its society to do something rare, to care about ideas that would not benefit those paying for them, to support scholars who challenged certainty, to preserve texts whose relevance was not yet clear. That is why Alexandria feels so modern and so fragile. We live in a world that produces knowledge at extraordinary speed, but speed is not preservation, access is not memory, storage is not stewardship. Digital archives can vanish as quietly as papyrus decays. Universities can hollow out without closing their doors. Expertise can be dismissed not because it is wrong, but because it is inconvenient. Alexandria's lesson is not that civilization is doomed to forget. It is that remembering requires effort, and effort must be renewed. What would the world look like if the Library of Alexandria had never burned down? Perhaps science would be older. Perhaps industry would be steadier. Perhaps power would be more evenly distributed. Perhaps humanity would have faced its ethical dilemmas sooner. Or perhaps it would have made the same mistakes earlier, with fewer excuses. We cannot know. What we can know is this. The survival of Alexandria would not have been an accident. It would have required continuous conscious choice. That choice confronts us still. Every archive funded or defunded, every library closed or expanded, every university treated as a public good or a private service, every research project judged by immediate profit or long-term value. These are not abstract decisions. They determine what future generations will know and what they will have to rediscover at great cost. The Library of Alexandria endures not because it survived, but because it failed. Its absence teaches us how easily continuity can be broken and how difficult it is to rebuild once it is gone. That is why it remains one of the most powerful symbols in human history, not a monument to lost genius, but a reminder that civilization is a process, not an achievement, a process that must be maintained, defended, and renewed, or it quietly unravels. So perhaps the most honest answer to the question we began with is also the simplest. If the Library of Alexandria had never burned down, the world would not be defined by what it knew. It would be defined by how seriously it took the responsibility of remembering. And that responsibility has never belonged to the past. It belongs to us.